able to save one, but he still drinks anti-caffeine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Every day, right before dinner.
All right, folks. Let's get started. So this morning, I will be talking to you all about impact comparison. Impact comparison, I think it's a very important part of debate. Fundamentally, debate is about cost-benefit assessment. A lot of folks kind of get the idea that, oh, we're having this debate, judges will decide if we won based on, how persuasive my arguments were, how well I was speaking, how many times I was able to cite historical examples, and those sort of things are all factors. They'll influence your speaker points, influence how judges are evaluating things, but fundamentally, the decision the judge makes about whether or not they vote AF or neg is about whether or not the costs to the plan outweigh the benefits, or vice versa. And impact comparison is an important part of that. And there are other parts of that. There's debating the link and the uniqueness and all of those parts of the disad and the advantage. So the judge is comparing the costs versus the benefits. The affirmative stands up and says, hey, ending the Cuban embargo will improve Latin American relations. And the neg says, hey, but it'll kill Cuban democracy movements. Then they have to evaluate a bunch of different factors. They have to evaluate how likely it is it actually kills those movements, how whether or not relations are good or bad now, whether or not the embargo is an important issue. But at the end level of all of that, the judge has to evaluate how much should I care about improving Latin American relations versus how much should I care about preserving democratic movements in Cuba. And that is where impact comparison steps into the equation. Impact comparison is your way of saying you should care more about our advantage than their disadvantage, or vice versa. There are kind of three main prongs of impact comparison. Does anyone know what I'm getting at? These terms you may have heard before? Yeah.
Like time frame?
Mm-hmm. Time frame.
Magnitude.
Probably.
Yeah, time frame, magnitude, probability. And they're somewhat, self-evident terms. Magnitude, how big is it? Time frame, how quick is it? Probability, how likely is it? But there's kind of a variety of different ways within each of those categories that you can make these comparisons effectively. So let's start with magnitude. In its most basic sense, most sort of debates are kind of evaluated basically by utilitarian body counts of sorts. As sort of crude as it might be, when you're talking about magnitude, you're literally talking about how many people would die if the global environment collapsed versus how many people would die if there was a nuclear war. 3 billion versus 1.5 billion, bigger. And it seems a little bit blasé to sort of throw around billions of people's lives in those terms, and often they're somewhat exaggerated, but that's still kind of ultimately the most useful way of thinking about magnitude, is just which one is likely to kill the most people, which one is likely to be the more consequential impact. So there's kind of a variety of ways to go about doing that. Sometimes you might have evidence that does this kind of stuff for you. So if you're comparing global warming versus nuclear war, which one do you think would be worse? Anyone have any opinions?
Nuclear war.
Why do you think that?
It's time frame.
Purely about magnitude. Let's just talk about magnitude right now. Which one do you think is worse in terms of the number of people that would die?
Global warming, because if the Earth's uninhabitable, then everyone will die. Whereas war, there's a chance some people might survive.
Okay.
Nuclear war may be small, whereas global warming could cause mass extinction.
Why?
Well, I mean, there's evidence out there about the plan causing nuclear war. It doesn't always specify whether or not it would be global or regional. And the regional evidence only talks about 1 billion or so dying, whereas global warming talks about mass extinction.
Why would global warming cause mass extinction?
Because
global.
at least the evidence claims that it would destroy, coastal cities, it would flood fertile plains that supply food for agriculture, or agriculture for food.
I mean, those sound like regional impacts to me. Why does that mean everyone dies? It just sounds like it sucks for people on the coasts.
Okay, well, people in Anyhow, it destroys means of producing food.
Destroys means of producing food?
Yeah, the icebergs melt and then they flood and they kill all agriculture and then we starve to death. And they also flood certain cities.
But what if a nuclear war throws a massive cloud of soot into the atmosphere that decreases global temperature by 1.5 degrees and causes all crops to fail for an entire year? That also kills food, right?
Well, a degree may not be as much as flooding and changing temperatures.
Okay. I mean, basically what I'm getting at is that these are debates that can be fleshed out on a variety of details. And it's not that helpful to kind of stand up in your 2NC and be like, oh, and our impact's bigger on magnitude because global warming would cause extinction and nuclear war wouldn't. You need to have some reasons. You kind of want to start fleshing out why might one of these impacts have only regional impacts, one of them's more global. What are the warrants and reasons for why those impacts would actually be problematic? And sometimes that's something you can do with evidence. So like in global warming versus nuclear war, there are a bunch of modeling scenarios done for the consequences for these things. So there's a big debate about whether or not nuclear winter would occur. And nuclear winter is that idea of soot going up into the atmosphere and kind of massively altering global temperatures for a year. Likewise, even if we know global warming is bad, there's definitely some debate about which specific consequences would occur. So kind of the most extreme version of the global warming argument says that our atmosphere will literally eventually turn into the atmosphere of Venus, and all life will be uninhabitable. Well, that's pretty bad, but it's also pretty extreme that we would ever get to the point where greenhouse gases run away to such an extent that like the balance of the atmosphere changes to no longer support carbon-based life. It seems a lot more likely that the impacts will be things like sea level rises, floods, disruptions in agriculture, spreading of diseases, and all of those things, when factored together, might be really consequential, but you kind of have to flesh out why each of those things would be so problematic. So, it's important to kind of, when you're discussing magnitude, to actually focus on the warrants for why particular things are going to be larger or more consequential, not just kind of saying, oh, well, yeah, obviously global warming's bigger because it has global in the name. We want to kind of try and move towards a somewhat more deep analysis of how these things might actually play out. A couple of different sort of general ways of comparing impacts in terms of magnitude that I think are helpful. One is when certain impacts are inclusive of another impact. And what I mean by that is that one impact is broad in scope and contains within it the other impact. An example might be something like global economic collapse versus a regional war scenario. So there's a bunch of different regional conflicts that people might talk about that will break out. Oh, there'll be a war between India and Pakistan, Iran and Israel, China, Taiwan, Russia, some random country in Central Asia. Whatever it is, there's all these regional conflict scenarios, Latin American conflict that, versus a global war, like World War I or World War II. And then there's evidence for economic collapse that kind of using World War II as the classic example that, hey, if the global economy collapses, then it'll sort of create incentives for a bunch of people to start fighting, that your countries will be running out of resources, you need to secure food, you need to secure territory, you need to secure wealth. There's sort of a desperate incentive for politicians to kind of gamble in a world where everyone's quality of life is degrading in an economic collapse. People start fighting, and that kind of triggers conflict scenarios across the world. That world war would probably be inclusive of various of those smaller regional scenarios. If the global economy collapses and that starts to set people against each other, fighting resource conflicts, then India and Pakistan are also likely to be fighting. Iran and Israel are also likely to be fighting. The regional impacts are a subset of the larger impacts. What's another impact that you all can think of that you kind of come across in debate that has that global application? Like an economy impact. Visionary on there? Anyone? There's a handful. Hegemony, classic example. If you have a hegemony impact and they have a regional war impact, your hegemony impact is usually, hey, if US hegemony declines, there'll be all sorts of conflicts across the globe. That could very easily include India, Pakistan, all these other countries. Anyone think of anything else that has that sort of global? Yeah, I mean, asteroid, that definitely seems bigger. And that's a good point, because it's not just it's inclusive of literally the same impact. Like, economic decline causes war, so it includes wars like India, Pakistan, Iran, Israel, etc. It's also just like economic decline affects everyone globally versus a small region. An asteroid, according to the evidence, would affect everyone globally, not just a small region. Obviously, that depends on the size of the asteroid, whether or not people are actually correct that like a giant one will come in and will cause dinosaur-esque extinction. But if there were something like that, then it would definitely be the kind of thing that that would be, global in scope. So there's a bunch of different examples of. There's a bunch of smaller, more specific impacts that tend to be regional, tend to be things like China, Taiwan, India, Pakistan, Iran, Israel. And there's larger sort of global structural impacts like hegemony, economic decline, asteroids, global warming, things that kind of affect the entire globe. Things that are not just affect more people, but that also affect the same people that the other impact does. So the other impact is just a subset of the larger impact. So that's one good way to sort of compare how your impact could outweigh on magnitude. The other good way is just when you have comparative evidence, which is kind of what I was getting at before. So there's people who write evidence that's like, hey, nuclear war would be worse than global warming, or hey, global warming would be worse than nuclear war. You won't always have evidence for that, but it's possible to kind of make those comparisons yourself, doing the sort of stuff that I was kind of prodding at in that first little section. It was just like kind of drawing out the consequences of various things, trying to make comparative statements about how certain impacts would affect other impacts, affect the world, etc. What's going to be worse, a world with a bunch of sea level rises and changes in global agriculture, or a regional nuclear war. Those are comparisons you can kind of try and flesh out by discussing reasons why those things might be worse or better or not as bad or whatever than other impacts. So either making comparisons. One very easy comparison is when your impact is inclusive of others. It's nice when you have evidence that does some of that comparisons for you, but you won't always have said evidence, and you should not consider it as necessary. But you should know that when you're making those arguments, again, kind of emphasis on the warrants for why those things will be bad. Not global warming, not our impact outweighs on magnitude because it causes extinction and theirs doesn't. You need a why. Why is your impact going to cause extinction and theirs won't? So, second kind of main axis of comparison for impacts, probability. I'll make an important distinction that applies for both probability and time frame. When we're talking about the probability of an impact, we are not talking about the likelihood of their disad being true. So a lot of times I'll hear debaters say something like, and our impact outweighs on probability because their uniqueness cards for their disad are really bad and it's just super unlikely to happen and we're going to be beating the crap out of their disad, so there's not going to be any probability of it. It's like, well, yes, you should beat the disad, but as I was trying to say before, there's two different levels of comparison. When the judge is assessing costs and benefits, they're assessing the validity of your advantage or your disadvantage, the sort of link and uniqueness claims. How likely is it that the plan is going to collapse Cuban democracy movements? How likely is it that the plan will restore relations with Latin America? But when we're talking about impact comparison, we're really bracketing out the question of the actual impact itself. So we're talking about, hey, nuclear proliferation. How likely is it that if countries acquire nuclear weapons, that will make them use them? Hey, hegemony. How likely is it that if hegemony declines, other countries will actually start fighting in the power vacuum? So probability is the probability of that actual terminal impact escalating, not the probability of the disad chain that gets them there. That's certainly something you should talk about. It's just a separate thing from impact comparison, and it's helpful to keep those things conceptually separate. So that being said, probability. Two kind of main ways to compare probability. Number one is to compare between structural impacts and event-based impacts. So what I mean by that is an event-based impact is a specific chain of events happening. X will lead to Y, will lead to China attacking Taiwan. X will lead to Y, will lead to India attacking Pakistan, or vice versa, or whatever. There's a very specific scenarios that have to occur to lead to a specific outcome. A structural impact is something that sort of affects the likelihood more broadly. That it's just a change in the international system that means that the probability of conflict in any situation goes up or goes down. So what would an example of a structural impact be that you all could think of?
U.S. hegemony prevents overall deterrence or something?
Yeah, U.S. hegemony is sort of a classic example of that. When we say, a decline of U.S. hegemony would cause war, we're not saying there's any specific conflict. We might outline possibilities. It could be Iran and Israel. It could be India and Pakistan. It could be China and Russia. But really, any of those things being true proves the statement, decline of hegemony causes war. The claim is really broader. It's just, in a world where there's not one powerful country regulating the international system, it is more likely that people will try and change the current balance of power and will end up fighting. So you're not making a specific prediction, which means if U.S. hegemony declines and India and Pakistan end up fighting, that supports the claim that a decline of hegemony would cause conflict. But even if India and Pakistan don't fight and China and Taiwan do, that still supports the claim that a decline of hegemony causes conflict. So any number of different conflict scenarios could come true that all prove that structural claim. So when conflict is more likely. Whereas when you say India and Pakistan will go to war, if China and Taiwan go to war, that's not your same impact. It hasn't proven your impact. It requires a very specific set of things to occur. So a very specific event is by definition less probable or less likely than a broader structural consequence. Because that broader structural consequence is just affecting or dampening the probability of conflict in any number of instances. So the structural impacts are sort of by definition more probable. What other sort of impacts might you think of that are structural? Any other ideas? There's a handful that I could think of. Throw them out. Who cares if you're wrong?
I guess global warming is impact because if it affects any portion of the globe, it's like, see, I told you, it's gonna happen.
Yeah, I mean, global warming, and there's definitely plenty of evidence about the security consequences of global warming as well. So there's evidence both that global warming has all these environmental consequences, but there's also just arguments that global warming will trigger resource conflicts, conflicts over migration, etc. And that's a structural prediction. Those things, it's just like if there are increased migration flows and decreased food production, conflict is more likely. There's no one specific situation that has to break out for that to be true, just kind of true broadly. Yeah?
Economic collapse leads to global warming.
Economic collapse, another classic example of a sort of broad structural impact. You're just making a theoretical claim that in a world where the economy declines, countries are more likely to fight. Doesn't matter which countries, you're not sort of making a very specific prediction, so it's an example of something that's broader and structural. Other examples are things like proliferation. Just like if countries have nuclear weapons, conflicts are more likely. Sometimes there can be kind of different variants of proliferation, so someone might have a very specific proliferation impact, like Iran proliferation will cause Israel to attack them. So then that's less structural and more like a specific event, but often people just sort of have generic proliferation advantages. We increase or decrease the likelihood of states across the globe acquiring nuclear weapons, which affects the likelihood of conflict sort of more broadly. There's other examples, but that kind of gives you a general sense of what I'm getting at. So one point of comparison for probability is structural versus event-based impacts. The second other important axis, I think, is systemic impacts. Does anyone know what I mean when I say systemic impacts? Have you heard that term in a debate before?
Like continually happening.
Something continually happening? Like, what's an example?
Like structural violence, you could say.
Yeah, so something like poverty is an example of structural violence. It's something that, it's not a prediction about something that will occur. It's something that is ongoing, that is definitely happening now, and that is inherently systemic. It is built into the system that this occurs. Poverty is something that is built into the system of our economy as it's currently structured. It exists. There's no question of its probability. Its probability is, by definition, 100%, because it's something that is occurring now and constantly occurring.
So for like the cap would that be like the impact because it's like
it causes like greed. Only like a certain percent of the world has like 90% of the wealth and all that. There's like all the poverty and all that.
Yeah, I think the numbers are even worse than that, but sure. And that's one element of the impact. I mean, there's a variety of different impacts that the CAP authors make. So there's also claims about capitalism causing resource shortages, which might lead to resource wars. There's arguments for why capitalism will hurt the environment, which get you back to global warming type impacts and stuff like that. But there's also sort of a structural or systemic impact to capitalism that is just like the way the economy is structured now constantly produces poverty and structural violence, and just like the quality of certain people's lives, especially outside of the United States and most other parts of the world, are massively impacted by that. Other examples you'll definitely come across this year, it's like the human rights advantage in Cuba, in the Cuba Act, is a good example of a systemic impact. There are human rights violations occurring in Cuba. People don't have access to food, water because of the embargo, shutting them off that. It's unacceptable. It's definitely occurring now. It's problematic. Anything else? Other ones that you all have come across in your experience? Racism, definitely an example of something that is systemic. I think it would be pretty difficult, unless you're Dinesh D'Souza, to contest that racism exists now. Other examples? Yeah.
Feminism?
Yeah, sexism, more specifically, unless you're saying feminism is the problem. Like we're saying sexism is the problem with which we need feminism as the solution, but yeah. Either way, yeah.
What about terrorism? What would that be?
Well, terrorism is more like a specific event. It's like the problem that we're worried about is not in the abstract the existence of terrorists. Like if they're all actually just hanging out in the mountains of Afghanistan doing whatever they do there, like no one would really care. The thing that we're concerned about is them, you know, bombing us or whatever it is that they're going to do, apparently. So that's more of a specific event. Because a bunch of different conditions would have to come true for a terrorist attack to actually happen. They would have to get weapons, they'd have to plan it, they'd have to not get caught, they'd have to have financing, they'd have to do all that business. So it's less probable because there's a bunch of specific events. So yeah, systemic impacts. Systemic impacts almost always going to have smaller magnitude, but basically always going to have higher probability. They are happening now, 100% likely. It generally tends to be stuff like poverty or human rights violations, structural violence, stuff like that. That's not high magnitude. It's not the kind of thing that's going to cause human extinction, but it is something that's super likely. It's definitely happening. It's an ongoing problem. It's systemic. So, third point of comparison, time frame. Time frame, basically, I think that the 2 sort of axes of comparison for probability are basically the same for time frame, but they just tend to go the other way. Well, at least for structural versus event-based impacts, it tends to go the other way. So impacts that are structural, like hegemony, economy, etc., are more likely because they don't depend on a specific set of predictions to come true. But they also, because they have no specific event that they're predicting, tend to have a very ambiguous time frame. When will hegemonic decline actually result in conflict? Well, I don't know. We're just saying it structurally makes conflict more likely, but what that conflict is, when it occurs, etc., is something that's less clear. Whereas if someone says, hey, you know, if the United States stops arms sales to Taiwan, that will immediately be perceived as a signal of weakness and cause China to attack Taiwan. It's like, well, that impact is very specific and is therefore less probable than a broader claim about the likelihood of conflict, but it's definitely an impact that's going to have a faster time frame because you have a very specific set of predictions about when something is going to occur, when something is going to be triggered. So the event-based impacts tend to be lower probability but higher time frame, and the structural impacts are higher probability but tend to have a longer time frame. So that sort of axis point of comparison goes the other way. The other sort of point of comparison is, again, systemic impacts. And systemic impacts, while having 100% probability, also have an immediate time frame. They are ongoing. They are occurring now. People are currently in poverty. There are people currently in Cuba who do not have access to food or water. There are people currently who are subjugated to the consequences of sexism, heteronormativity, racism, etc. So those impacts, while being smaller, in terms of a traditional sense of magnitude as lives lost, are impacts that are also more probable and have faster time frames.
Wait, can you repeat it again? You said event-based impacts?
Yeah. So event-based impacts tend to have a lower probability, but a higher or a quicker time frame, because they rely on a specific set of predictions, but because they have that specific set of predictions, they also have outlined exactly how this scenario is going to occur. So they tend to have something that's more likely to occur quickly.
So then if you could prove that the event-based impact will happen by different means, does that do anything to it?
What do you mean by different means?
Like if they say that nuclear proliferation leads to nuclear war and you say something else leads to nuclear war, but not nuclear proliferation?
I mean, it depends exactly what you're saying, but it's essentially what you're getting at is like a uniqueness or alternate causality argument.
Okay.
So it's the same sort of thing if someone said like, hey, our plan solves global warming, and you're like, oh, but there's this other thing that's going to cause massive amounts of emissions, so you won't be able to solve.
Okay.
It's basically like a solvency argument against their impact.
Okay.
So it's certainly, now you have to actually have evidence that thing would occur or whatever. It can't just kind of be an observation that it's like.
So it seems to me that you would do this if your plan solved for that alt thing, but not the first.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So you might say something like, if you have a hegemony impact and they have a proliferation impact, you'd be like, yeah, proliferation makes nuclear war more likely, but as long as the US is the hegemon, then countries aren't actually going to challenge us or use those nuclear weapons. So hegemony sort of deters proliferation from escalating, but if hegemony collapses, then nuclear war would occur, so we kind of access the same impact. It's inevitable. So you can use your impacts to kind of get at that stuff, for sure.
Okay.
So, those are kind of the three main areas of comparison. And these sort of categories should not be seen as exclusive. There are definitely other ways to discuss time frame or probability that might kind of come up in specific situations. And just kind of your attempt to flesh out some of the warrants or describe how these scenarios might play out is always valuable. But these are kind of what I think are kind of the most helpful ways of framing impacts compared against each other. So these are sort of situations that will tend to come up a lot. You'll see the same sort of impacts bandied about in debate. You'll have a variety of situations where you have an impact like hegemony or the economy that is structural versus an impact like an India-Pakistan war that is specific. So you'll want to learn how to compare why you should prefer structural impacts to specific impacts and vice versa. You'll want to learn how to compare systemic impacts against higher magnitude but lower probability impacts. So like poverty, human rights violations versus a nuclear war. Trying to make the case that we should care more about the small magnitude impacts that are high probability instead of letting ourselves be distracted by the high magnitude impacts that are low probability. So these are all sort of access points of comparison that will come up a lot and that are good to master. And one sort of important takeaway from this is that you do not need to, and in fact probably should not, make a magnitude, probability, and time frame argument for every impact. Some impacts just aren't one of those things, like aren't better on one of those points of comparison. Like if you are going for the human rights impact, it's not even worth trying to make a claim that your impact is larger on magnitude than a nuclear war. It's not. If you're going to win that your human rights impact outweighs nuclear war, you're going to win that by winning that probability and time frame are more important than magnitude. So it's just like I'll often kind of hear a lot of speeches where people are basically just like, oh, I need to say A magnitude, B time frame, C probability. And they'll just end up saying things that their impacts aren't actually faster or more probable, don't make that much more sense. Just like find the point of comparison on which your impact is best and focus on it. If your impact is bigger and faster, but is not as probable, then emphasize magnitude and time frame. If your impact is fast and probable, but not as big, emphasize probability and time frame. You don't have to make every three of those things for each impact. You want to make the ones that are actually the best points of comparison for your impact. If your impact is big and probable, but not that fast, something like global warming, then you don't want to emphasize time frame. You don't want to try and say, oh, our global warming impact outweighs on time frame against their, India-Pakistan war. It's just sort of a frivolous use of your energy and time. You're not going to convince anyone that time frame, that your global warming impact outweighs on time frame. You might as well just spend your time convincing the judge that time frame isn't that important instead. So don't feel compelled to make a magnitude, time frame, and probability argument for each impact that you extend. Try and figure out where they're the strongest and focus on those. The sort of fourth component of impact comparison is turns the case, which could also be case turns the disad. And this is basically the category of interactions, ways in which your impact interacts with the other team's impact. Examples, economic decline undermines U.S. hegemony. We need material power and economic strength to maintain the hegemon, maintain our hegemony, our leadership. So if the economy declines, it would influence hegemony. It's an example of a way that an impact turns or interacts with another impact. What other sort of points of interaction between any two random impacts can you think of? Pick any two random impacts. Come up with a reason why one interacts with the other.
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So, like, should we do the turns the case arguments after doing the time frame probability?
Yeah. Yeah, generally it's just like magnitude, time frame, probability. Now, disad turns the case. Or if you're af, magnitude, time frame, probability. Now, case turns the disad. Yeah.
Global warming leads to nuclear war.
Yeah, global warming, why?
Because scarcity of food resources forces nations to fight over the last remaining fertile plains.
Boom. Yeah. Global warming causes resource scarcity over food, etc. Causes resource wars and conflicts. Turns your conflict-based impacts. What are some other interactions you all might think of? Anything?
Hegemonic decline leads to economic decline.
Yeah.
Because we need to fund the conflicts that will spring from the loss of hegemony. That'll, in an overstressed economy already, we can't do that.
So yeah, if hegemonic decline causes a bunch of regional conflicts, we'll get drawn into them. Those will be expensive, etc. There's also plenty of arguments that a hegemon is necessary to sort of preserve, to basically act as the distributor of public goods to keep, lanes of communication open for sea trade. There's definitely other arguments too for why hegemony interacts with the economy. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say sustaining hedge sustains relations or can help relations.
Okay. And why might that be the case?
Well, like with the U.S. is hedge power. It keeps certain countries such as North and South Korea from fighting, and so it keeps disputes from arising.
Okay, so if someone had a specific regional conflict, like a Korean War or India-Pakistan War, it'd say U.S. hegemony lets us kind of mediate those disputes, prevent them from escalating.
Human rights violations leads to war.
And why might that be true?
Well, if you have a situation like in Syria, that could lead to civil war. As other regional partners get involved, that could lead to a larger regional war, could lead to a global war.
Yeah, so you want some evidence about your specific set of things, why the human rights violations you're talking about would produce civil war. But it's certainly possible that human rights could generate civil conflict, and civil conflicts will often draw in outside powers and escalate. A couple kind of things to think about when you're thinking about these comparisons. One is diversity is important. And this is something that we'll probably emphasize as being true in most contexts throughout debate. There's no need to just come up with one turns the case argument and move on. If you can come up with more different reasons why your impact interacts with the case, then the more the merrier. These are all arguments that are very, very important to how judges will evaluate debates. Very good impact calculus kind of frames how a judge will go about evaluating other things in the debate. If you convince them that your impact is just so much more important than their impact, then the judge will just kind of be thinking oh, well, the neg just doesn't have to win quite as much of this disad as the af has to win of their case. They'll just kind of set a lower burden on how much you have to win your uniqueness and your link because you were so convincing about how important your impact is. It doesn't mean that if you drop an internal link takeout that they'll just vote for you anyway, but just kind of as an underlying sort of factor, the better your impact calculus is, the more convincing it is, kind of the easier time the judge will have voting for you. It's just like the way that they're evaluating the debate, they'll kind of be giving you a little bit more slack on some of the other stuff if you kind of frame the debate through your impact calculus. And that's particularly true with reasons why your case turns the disad or vice versa. I can't tell you how many debates I've judged where it's come down to just two really close advantages, like an advantage against a disadvantage. It's like, there's this disad, the AF's got a bunch of really good arguments, the neg does an okay job, I don't know, there's some risk of it, I can't tell you exactly how much, I can't tell you if it's 30, I can't tell you if it's 20%, there's just some risk, it's minimized, there's this advantage, the neg had some really good arguments, it was really, really close, the AF made an attempt to, there's some risk, I can't tell you how big it is, maybe 30, maybe 20, I don't really know, but the affirmative made an argument that their impact would solve the impact of the disad. So even if there's a low risk of both of them, there's some chance that if I preserve US hegemony, that will prevent economic decline from causing conflict. And the other team did not make a comparison the other way. So it's like if you make those sort of comparisons about how your impact can interact and access their impact, they can be super important for how the judge kind of sorts through and evaluates the debate. So you want to kind of give yourself a diversity of those arguments, as many as you can come up with that you can have warrants for. 3 or 4 is a decent random number. You might not always be able to come up with that many. And the same thing I was saying before, don't force it just for the sake of having more arguments. But if you can come up with a reason why your impact interacts with theirs, it's super helpful. So there's all sorts of different interactions. Global warming turns conflict, economic decline turns hegemony turns proliferation, any sort of different interactions that you can come up with that are helpful. One other kind of point, slightly trickier to wrap your head around. Especially when you're negative, there's a difference between saying that the disad turns the case and that the status quo solves the case. So, for example, if we're reading the Cuban democracy disad, the negative could make an argument that if democracy emerges in Cuba, so if they win their uniqueness, if democracy is emerging now, then that democracy will solve human rights. If there's a democracy in Cuba, there won't be human rights violations. They could also even say that if that democracy emerges in Cuba, that the United States would then lift the embargo. It's basically written into law. It's basically the reason we have the embargo was to make Cuba democratic. And there's a certain set of conditions that are sort of written into the law that are like, if Cuba can demonstrate free and transparent elections, this and that, and a bunch of other standards, then we'll lift the embargo. So if Cuba actually becomes democratic, if we win our uniqueness, then your case will happen, or we'll solve the whole act. So those are reasons why the status quo solves the case. There are arguments for why if your uniqueness comes true, that will actually, it's like your uniqueness for your disad is a counterplan that can solve their advantage. On the flip side, you might make an argument like, hey, if our disad impact comes true and there's a nuclear conflict, then that will make human rights violations worse. And that's a reason why the disad turns the case. If the judge votes neg, there's no chance that you're going to resolve human rights. You're just making an argument that the AF won't solve them either because your impact will make it worse. So a turns the case argument is basically an AF doesn't solve argument. Our impact will make it impossible for them to solve their impact. If economic decline happens, then they won't be able to preserve hegemony. If nuclear war happens, they won't be able to solve human rights violations. So it's basically a solvency takeout to the AF. Whereas, if you make the argument that the status quo solves the case, you're basically making a counterplan of sorts using your uniqueness. If we are right about uniqueness, that resolves the impacts the AF has outlined. So it's our disad can solve their impacts versus our disad makes their impacts less relevant. Why is that distinction significant enough to note? The reason is basically because of a concept that is often called try or die. And this is sort of moving into the next section of impact comparison, which is kind of big picture ways of framing why certain ways of evaluating impacts matter. So you can say our impact has a larger magnitude, you can say our impact is more probable, you can say our impact has a quicker time frame, and then comes the next step, which is saying, probability is more important than time frame. Time frame is more important than magnitude. Magnitude is more important than time frame. So not only making comparisons about which of your impacts is bigger or which is more likely, but making arguments and comparisons about which of those standards is most important. Should we look at big impacts with low probability, or should we look at smaller impacts with high probability? Which of those things is most important? And one, in this sort of category of framing type arguments, ways of comparing risk and analyzing them, a common argument that comes up is the idea of try or die. And try or die is almost always an argument made by the affirmative. And it's basically an argument that gets made in a very specific situation. And that situation is when the negative is only going for solvency takeouts against an advantage. So if your advantage says proliferation is happening now, proliferation will kill everyone via nuclear war, and the plan improves U.S.-Latin America relations, and U.S.-Latin American relations solve proliferation. That's your advantage. Now let's say that the negative stands up, and they just go all in on your plan won't solve relations, and Latin America is just not important for solving proliferation. There's too many other issues that are affecting Latin America, U.S. trade subsidies, Guantanamo Bay, immigration policies. Lifting the embargo is just not going to be sufficient to address those things. And even if it was, Latin America is just not that important of a player on containing proliferation. We really need Russia and China. They're the big powers who can give support to countries like Iran and North Korea. They're the ones we need on board. Latin America is just not important. The neg makes all these arguments. Neg's really good at them. But what components of the advantage has the negative not contested?
Your impact.
And? Your impact and what else?
Its chance of happening.
And? What direction is the status quo going? What's happening now?
Oh, it hadn't addressed
Yeah, they haven't addressed the uniqueness to your advantage. Proliferation is coming now. So there are two claims the negative has not addressed while making this very persuasive case that your affirmative doesn't solve. The two arguments they have not addressed: proliferation is happening now, proliferation will cause nuclear war and extinction. That means that they have not addressed the claim that right now, in the status quo, we were going to have a nuclear war. If you vote negative, there will be a nuclear war, because the negative is defending the status quo. If you vote affirmative, maybe there's not very much of a chance that you solve it. The negative has been very convincing about their solvency arguments, about us not being able to solve relations, about relations not being important to solve proliferation, but there's some chance. You're saying there's a chance. There's a 1% chance that the plan could maybe solve proliferation. And given that, if we don't do anything, the negative has not contested that right now, without doing anything, we're for sure going to have a nuclear war. Well, we might as well try to solve instead of dying, even if our probability of solving is very low. And that's where that term try or die comes from. This idea that even if your probability of solving the case is very low, that if the status quo is just inevitably in trouble, if bad things are going to happen now and cause conflict and extinction and whatnot, then the affirmative should at least try and solve this conflict instead of, voting negative. So voting negative has no shot. Now, that's where that difference between the case solves the disad and the disad turns the case comes in. If you said, hey, our disad has some hegemony impact, it's like a politics disad or whatever, Herndon will talk about that in an hour, next hour. So if your disad has hegemony impact, the neg could say, hey, if hegemony declines, we won't be able to solve proliferation. Or if hegemony declines, it will also cause proliferation. So that's a reason why the disad turns the case. The disad impact causes the case impact, makes it impossible for the app to solve the case impact. But even if the negative made that argument, it doesn't change the fact that proliferation is already occurring now. So yeah, sure, if hegemony declines, there will be proliferation. There's already proliferation. Your case turn is non-unique. On the flip side, if the negative instead said, that US hegemony solves proliferation. A world where we have hegemony deters countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. What component of the advantage does that contest? So remember, their advantage basically has 4 claims. Proliferation occurring now, plan helps relations, relations solve proliferation, proliferation causes conflict. If the negative says that a world of US hegemony stops countries from proliferating, what claim does that contest?
They're stating that the status quo turns the case? Or the status quo solves for the case?
Yeah, if the negative is saying the status quo solves for the case because hegemony deters countries from ever acquiring nuclear weapons, then which one of those 4 components of the case does that answer?
The impact, like the terminal impact.
Well, but it could still be true, even if the US stops countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, that if countries acquired nuclear weapons, it would cause war. So their impact claim is hypothetical. Their impact claim is if countries acquired nuclear weapons, it would lead to war. So the claim that hegemony will prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons in the first place doesn't necessarily disprove the claim that if they acquired nuclear weapons, it would be bad.
It takes out the link.
Why?
Because if countries can't get weapons, then the impact is irrelevant because it won't happen.
But what does that have to do with whether or not the relations would solve? The link is the claim that relations with Latin America solve proliferation. I'm not saying you're totally wrong. I'm just trying to think through this process collectively.
There wouldn't be proliferation to solve. There's like
Boom. That's what I'm looking for. There wouldn't be proliferation to solve. The component of the case that argument defeats is basically the uniqueness component. The negative is saying US hegemony exists now, and the plan kills it. Even if they didn't win that the plan kills it, the negative is saying as long as US hegemony exists, which is now, countries will not acquire nuclear weapons. Which means, right now, countries will not acquire nuclear weapons. So that answers the uniqueness component of the act. Proliferation will not occur now. And the reason that distinction is so important is that upsets the balance of try or die that the affirmative is trying to set up. Remember, in order for try or die to be an appropriate framing for the affirmative, the negative has to not contest uniqueness and impact. Try or die is only a thing that happens when the negative is going purely for solvency takeouts. Your act does not solve this problem. But the act could still stand up and say, you're right, there's very little chance we solve this problem, but you've conceded that 25 countries are going to get nuclear weapons right now, and they'll start a bunch of conflicts and we're all going to die. So even if there's a very low chance that we solve, we have to try and do something. But if the negative stands up and says, well, our disad impact prevents those countries from ever getting nuclear weapons in the first place, then it's no longer a try or die type situation. There's no longer something we have to try and solve because the disad impact, the status quo is already solving it. So arguments for why the status quo solves their impact are even more important than the sort of standard set of turns the case arguments. Questions about that? I know that's kind of confusing, and honestly, it'll probably take you a little bit longer and some actual practical experience to figure out exactly what I'm talking about. It probably took me until my first year of college before I really understood what try or die meant. But then something eventually clicked for me, so eventually you'll get why this is important. Trust me. But is there anything in this moment that is still not making sense? It'll make more sense when you see it kind of play out. And when there's some debate that you're convinced you won, and a judge is like, I know that you were winning like 100% of your disad, and the AF was winning like 2% of their case, but you lost because try or die, and then you'll understand, I gotta make arguments for why the DA solves the case. I get it now. I promise. It'll be worth it. All right, a couple other sort of things in the category of ways of comparing magnitude, probability, and time frame. So not comparing within them. Remember what I was saying, there's saying our impact has a bigger magnitude, and then they're saying magnitude is more important than probability or time frame. So try or die is sort of one classic framing it doesn't exactly fit into that category, but try or die is basically an argument for why magnitude outweighs probability. It's basically like, hey, if we're all screwed by this huge impact that's going to kill us all, then we need to do whatever we can to solve it, even if the probability of solving it is somewhat low. And, you know, it doesn't exactly perfectly fit because it's kind of relating to the probability of solvency, which, as I was getting at before, the probability of the link or the probability of solvency is different from the probability of the impact. So it's not purely just an impact comparison argument. Try or die is sort of a broader risk calculus argument about how the judge should evaluate the debate. But it's an important thing that comes up enough, and I can't tell you how many times I hear the phrase try or die when it is not try or die. The number of times people are like, oh, you have to vote for us, it's try or die for an impact. And I'm like, you have no idea what try or die means. You don't have a uniqueness argument. It can't be try or die. They went for a counterplan. It can never be try or die. It's like, it can't be try or die if you're going for a counterplan. They're trying. Anyway, sorry, side rant. So other sort of ways of comparing why magnitude, probability, or time frame are most important. I'll just quickly go through a few more that I think come up a fair amount. Another argument for why magnitude outweighs probability is basically what I would call the diamonds are forever argument. And it's basically, if you have an impact that can access extinction, and they have an impact that does not, then no matter how much more likely their impact is than yours, extinction, just being so finite, like the end of all humanity, outweighs no matter what their probability is. And the reason is basically, it comes kind of from, there's this dude, Jonathan Schell, who was like an anti-nuclear activist during the Cold War, trying to pursue disarmament of nuclear weapons. And he was like, we have to get rid of all nuclear weapons, because as long as we have nuclear weapons around, there's some chance that we'll use them. And if we ever use them, it will cause human extinction because nuclear winter. And there's been a lot more debate since Jonathan Schell was writing in the early 1980s about nuclear winter theory and whether or not it's true. But at the time, he was quite convinced that a nuclear war would cause human extinction. And basically, he was saying, hey, if human extinction ever occurs, not only are all 7 billion people that are currently alive going to die, but also every future human who would have ever hypothetically been born will not be born, because the human race is now extinct. So the magnitude of an extinction impact is not just 7 billion, it's in fact infinity, because it's all 7 billion people that are currently alive, plus all future humans in perpetuity. Now, if your impact is infinity, any impact that is short of extinction is definitionally infinitely far away from infinity. So your impact is going to outweigh on magnitude by just miles against anything else if you win that your impact causes extinction and theirs doesn't. And the reason this is important is there's basically sort of a general idea that risk is probability times magnitude. So like, if I say there's a 50% chance that 100 people will die, then on average 50 people are dying. Basically multiply these things together. Now the thing is, what is anything other than 0 multiplied by infinity?
Infinity.
Infinity. So even if I was like, there is a 0.000000000000001% chance that infinity of people will die, on average, infinity people die. So no matter how low the probability of my impact is, if I win that it's extinction, it outweighs. Always. Now, on the flip side of this equation is a case for why probability outweighs magnitude. And it's an argument that I would basically call the 1% doctrine. Do any of you all know what that's a reference to?
Isn't that theory where like 1% is technically like always infinite percent is always going to be like 100% or something along that line?
Well, do you know who I'm trying to reference? There's a particular individual that is kind of associated with the 1% theory. It's part of the Bush administration.
No, I was going to say Bowstring.
No.
Cheney, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Dick Cheney.
Oh.
Wild guess. If I'm talking about something evil from the Bush administration, Dick Cheney is a good way to go. So basically, Dick Cheney was had something where he was saying when they were discussing the war on terrorism, they're like, well, do you think it's really like worth taking away all of these civil liberties and impugning on people's private